Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Commander Adventures. This week we have a couple of new faces, alongside a couple of returning players. We start off with Joe, raising the dead with Meren of Clan Neltoth. We then have Michael, splitting his attention with Riku of Two Reflections. We then have George, trying to find redemption alongside Rhys the Redeemed. And finally that leaves us with Alex, who's partnering up with Ishai, Ojutai Dragonspeaker, and Ludevic Necro-Alchemist. Let's hop in. Joe starts us off. He drops the Temple of Malady for turn, and then leaves the card he scries on top of Library. Michael drops a Mystic Confluence, and then pings himself to cast a Soul Ring. He follows up with a Simic Signet and passes. George drops a Forest, and then uses it to cast an Exploration. He follows up with his second Forest for turn, and then casts his commander Rhys. Alex drops a Mystic Monastery and passes. Joe untaps. He drops a Forest for turn, and then he casts a Birds of Paradise. Michael untaps. He drops an Island, and then passes off to George. George untaps. He drops a Plains, and then casts his own Soul Ring. He then taps his remaining mana to cast an Explosive Vegetation. He puts a Forest and a Plains into play tapped, and then moves to combat. He swings his commander at Joe for 1 damage. Alex untaps. He drops a Plains and passes. Joe untaps. He drops a Swamp, and then taps out to cast Meren. At Joe's end step, Michael casts Fact or Fiction. He chooses Alex to make the piles. And then Michael bins Turnabout and Growth Spiral to take a pile with Seedborn Muse, Rowan, and River's Rebuke. Michael untaps. He drops a mountain, and passes, waiting to see what everyone else is planning. George untaps. He then ramps even harder with a Kadama's Reach. He grabs a Forest tapped, and then takes a Plains to hand which he plays for turn. Alex drops a Meandering River tapped, and passes. Joe drops a Swamp for turn, and then in an effort to keep up with George, casts his own Kadama's Reach. He grabs a Forest tapped, and then takes a Swamp to hand. He then moves to combat, and hits George for 3 commander damage. Michael drops a Forest for turn, and then follows it up by casting a Seedborn Muse. As Michael moves to his end step, George activates Rhys to create a 1/1 Elf Warrior token. When he regains priority, George follows up with an Enlightened Tutor, and puts a Mirari's Wake on top of his library. George untaps, and Michael untaps alongside him. As George moves to resolve his Mirari's Wake, Michael is ready with a Cryptic Command. He takes the damage from Mana Confluence, and elects to counter the Mirari's Wake and draw a card. Alex and Michael both untap. Alex then drops a Desolate Lighthouse for turn, and finishes up by casting a Lightning Greaves. Joe and Michael both untap. Joe drops a Swamp for turn, and then drops an Ashnod's Altar. Michael drops an Island for turn, and then casts an Unexpected Results. He reveals a mountain after shuffling his library, and it enters untapped. and with that, Unexpected Results resolves back to his hand. He then casts a Mole Drifter for its evoke cost, and as it enters, he draws 2, and then sacrifices it. As Michael moves to end step, Joe casts a Death Sprout targeting Seedborn Muse. Michael doesn't have a response, so Seedborn Muse dies. And then Joe goes to grab a forest, tapped. As Michael tries to end his turn again, George uses Rhys to create another Elf Warrior. George untaps for turn. He casts a Shamanic Revelation, and draws a total of 3 cards. He then drops a Shalai Voice of Plenty, and then moves to combat, hitting Michael for 1 commander damage. Alex drops a Mountain, and then taps out to cast a Keranos, God of Storms. Joe drops a Swamp for turn. He then casts a Zulaport Cutthroat. Finally, he moves to combat and hits Michael with Meren for 3. Michael untaps. He drops a Forest for turn, and then casts a Solemn Simulacrum. He grabs an island tapped, and then recasts Unexpected Results. He reveals a forest after a shuffle, and then the spell resolves back to his hand again. George untaps. He casts a Mana Reflection for turn, and then passes. Alex untaps. On his draw step, he reveals a land to Keranos, and then draws an additional card. He then drops a Cascade Bluffs. He casts a Supreme Verdict to wipe the board, and Joe gets 2 experience counters, and drains everyone for 2 damage, while gaining 2 life as his board dies. Joe drops a forest. He recasts Meren, and at end step uses her trigger to bring back Zulaport Cutthroat. Michael drops a City of Brass for turn, and then casts a Spellseeker. He tutors for a tutor with its trigger, and then cast Unexpected Results again. He reveals a Rude Awakening, and taps all his lands for mana in preparation to resolve the free cast. However, Alex responds by negating the Rude Awakening. Michael then casts Will Kenrith. He upticks his walker, causing both Zulaport Cutthroat and Meren to become 0/3 creatures with no abilities until his next turn. George untaps, and decides he wants even more mana. He casts a Zendikar Resurgent to achieve this, and follows up by casting an Anointed Procession. With a token doubler in play, he decides he needs a couple of outputs, so he recasts Rhys, and draws off a Zendikar Resurgence cast trigger. He then follows up with the Oketra he drew, and draws again off a Zendikar Resurgent. He drops the forest he drew, and funnels his remaining mana into Oketra to produce 2 warriors thanks to Anointed Procession. Alex reveals and assembles the Legion to Keranos' trigger, and uses it to bolt Rhys. He then drops an island for turn, and passes to Joe. With both Meren and Zulaport currently as vanilla creatures, Joe passes turn. Michael untaps, and then upticks Will after his draw step, targeting both Oketra and Meren. He then casts a Sylvan Scrying to go and grab a Reliquary Tower. He drops it for turn, and then casts a River's Rebuke, targeting George. George returns all of his non-land permanents to hand, and Michael passes off. George untaps, and begins to rebuild. He casts a Soul Ring, and follows it up with Mana Reflections. He then uses his remaining mana to recast both Rhys and Exploration. At his end step, Alex pays 4 into Sphinx's Revelation, gaining 4 life, and drawing 4 cards. Alex then untaps for turn, and reveals a Brainstorm as his first draw. He uses Keranos' trigger to bolt Rhys again. He then drops a Temple of Enlightenment, and scries the top card of his library to the bottom. He drops a Search for his Kanta, and then passes turn. At his end step, Joe casts Assassin's Trophy on Will Kenrith in an attempt to actually be able to play this game. Michael lets it resolve, and goes to grab a mountain untapped. Joe untaps, and then drops a Sepulchral Primordial. He grabs George's Shalai, Michael's Seedborn Muse, and then does not have a target from Alex. He then passes. Michael and Joe both untap, and then Michael drops an Alchemist Refuge for turn. He casts a Blasphemous Act for 2, and wipes the board again. Joe gets a total of 4 more experience counters, and drains each of his opponents for 4, while gaining 4 life himself. Michael then gambles, and randomly discards his Mystical Tutor. He follows up with the Day's Undoing, and everyone shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library. And then draws up a new hand of 7. Finally, Day's Undoing exiles itself, and Michael's turn ends. George untaps, and during his upkeep, Alex casts a Wear and Tear to destroy both Joe's Ashton's Altar and George's Mana Reflection. George drops a pair of forests in his main one, and then casts his own Seedborn Muse. He then casts an Eladamri's Call, and tutors an Eternal Witness to hand. He then casts the Eternal Witness, and uses it to return Mana Reflections to hand. Alex untaps. He decides to put Assemble the Legion in the graveyard from Search for Azcanta trigger, and then reveals a Scalding Tarn with Keranos, drawing an additional card. He drops the Tarn for turn, and casts a Commander Sphere. He then casts the first of his commanders, Ludevic, and cracks the Tarn to grab an island. He then casts Ishai, and equips Ludevic with his Lightning Greaves. He hits Joe with Ludevic for 1 commander damage, and draws at end step from his trigger. Joe drops a Viridian Zealot. This cast puts a +1/+1 Ishai, and then Joe uses the Zealot's ability to destroy Search for Azcanta. He follows up with a Golgari Fine Broker, and recurs the Zealot to hand. He then drops a tapped Overgrown Tomb. With that done, he moves to pass turn, and Michael activates Alchemist Refuge to flash in Will Kenrith. He elects not to grab Rowan with the Partner With trigger, and moves to his turn. Michael untaps, and drops an island for turn. He downticks Will, draws 2 cards, and reduces his instants and sorceries by 2 until his next turn. As this happens, the table clarifies Ludevic's trigger, and realizes Joe should have drawn a card since Michael took damage during Joe's turn. Michael then casts a Steam Augury, and makes his piles. And Joe gives him the pile with Izzet Signet, Growth Spiral, and Manamorphose. Michael casts the Izzet Signet, and then reveals why he didn't search for Rowan by casting her from hand. He upticks her, forcing George's creatures to attack on George's next turn. George untaps, and then draws for turn. He recast Mana Reflections, and then cast a Finale of Glory where X is 10. He creates 10 2/2 soldiers and 10 4/4 angels. He then must attack, and shows the downside of Rowan by sending Seaborn Muse at will and Eternal Witness at Rowan. Will dies, and George passes. Alex sacks his Commander Spirit end step, and then reveals Saheeli Rai to Keranos on upkeep. He bolts Joe with the damage, and then resolves Saheeli and Felidar Guardian. He triggers the famous standard killing combo. Here's how the Saheeli Felidar Guardian combo works. You downtick Saheeli, targeting Felidar Guardian. As the token copy of Felidar enters the battlefield, you use it to blink Saheeli. As she re-enters, she counts as a new instance of Saheeli which has not been activated this turn. You can then downtick her again to repeat this process. In the end, you have infinite 1/4 cats with haste, move to combat, and swing lethal at your opponents. And wins out. Game review. Alex really snagged this victory from the jaws of defeat. He was able to strategically wipe the board to keep his opponents behind, and to remove just enough of George's permanents to keep him constantly rebuilding. Even so, after the game, George revealed he had a Triumph of the Hordes in hand. Had he reached his next turn, George would have surely won. Joe was constantly on the edge of pulling off a value engine. With the amount of recursion he had with Meren and Golgari Finebroker, another turn or two would have allowed him to set up to control the outcome of the game. Finally, Michael was constantly getting closer and closer to victory. He was really digging for an output for all of his mana. In the end though, strong draw power, selective control, and a little bit of luck gave Alex this victory. I'd like to thank all the players for being a part of this game, and as always give a quick shout out to Dungeon Games and Fort Myers for allowing us to film. If you enjoyed seeing Alex, feel free to check out his channel, EOT Newsflash, here. He breaks down new product as it's released, and does limited reviews for each new set. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know by leaving a like and a comment, and be sure to subscribe to see more of our Commander content. I look forward to seeing you next week, and as always, thank you very much for watching.